The north is cold and full of whispers.
The torches didn't behave properly this deep. That was the first thing Ned noticed. 2 hours before dawn, on the last night he would spend as a man who did not know what his bloodline had been built to carry. The torches he'd lit at the crypt entrance, 3 of them, good northern tallow with a clean burn, should have thrown steady light in still air. There was no wind this far below Winterfell. There was nothing in the world this far below Winterfell. But the flames leaned, not toward the entrance, not toward the wall, not in any direction a draft would have explained. They leaned the way a man leans when he hears his name called from somewhere he cannot locate, toward and away at once, as if they disagreed with each other about where the sound was coming from. Ned walked deeper. He had come here hundreds of times in 35 years. Every man who called himself Lord of Winterfell came to the crypts with frequency, if he was honest with his dead the way the Starks had always tried to be. You walked past the effigies of your fathers and their fathers, and the long line of stone men going back past the point where the names became illegible, past the point where there were names at all. You let the cold remind you of what mattered. It kept a man's thinking clean. He had never gone as deep as he was going tonight. He didn't know, yet, why tonight was different. The air changed the further he descended, the cold acquiring a quality he had no word for, something that was not simply the absence of heat, but the presence of something else, something that had intention. The smell was iron and age, and the particular silence of enclosed stone that had not shifted in a very long time. Old water finding old channels through old rock, somewhere below him, not dripping, seeping, patient. The torches gave up their argument. All 3, simultaneously and without wind, pointed the same direction, ahead. Down, Ned kept walking. He had passed the tomb before. Every Stark had passed it. Every lord, every boy on a dare, every Stark child who had crept down here in the dark to prove something to themselves. It sat apart from the others in a way that resisted explanation. No alcove carved to receive it. No stone platform. It stood in the deepest chamber of the lowest level, like a fact that had predated the chamber, like the chamber had been built around it rather than the other way around. The effigy was a craftsman. Ned stopped. He looked for what he later understood was the first time he had truly looked. The hands, which on all the others were raised or resting on sword pommels or folded across stone chests, were positioned differently, open, downward-facing. The posture of a man who had just set something down, who had just finished something, not a warrior, not a lord, no sword across the lap. He stared at the empty stone for a long time. Every other effigy in every level of the crypts had the iron binding, the blade laid across to keep the spirit from wandering. The reason had been explained to him as a boy. Tradition, precaution, the North's ancient unease with its own dead. This effigy had no sword because it did not need to be bound. The thought arrived without warning, not a deduction, a knowing, because it is the source of the binding. He reached out and touched the rune carved into the effigy's chest, not the face, the chest, where a heartbeat would have been. In the man this stone was cut to remember. The stone was warm. Ned did not pull back. The warmth was not aggressive. It was not the warmth of a fire or a living body. It was the warmth of deep water, of something that had been generating heat at the center of the earth for 8,000 years and had simply not stopped. Under his fingers the rune's edges deepened. Either the stone was moving, which was not possible, or his fingers fit it precisely, which was worse. A pulse. Once. The way a door sounds when it recognizes a key, then a sound, click, mechanical, clean, precise enough to be insulting after so much silence. A mechanism engineered in the Age of Heroes, still working, because the man who built the wall had understood that the things that needed to last required a different quality of attention than the things that merely needed to endure. The floor moved. 3 feet wide, 5 feet long, a section beside the tomb descended 6 inches and slid sideways on a track that should have been corroded into permanence 1,000 years ago. The steps beneath were cut from black stone. They descended into a chamber that existed in no Winterfell map, no Winterfell record, no Winterfell memory. The floor had been waiting for his blood. It had recognized it. 8,000 years of waiting, and it recognized it. Ned descended. The chamber was older than the crypts. That was the first thought that organized itself. Everything else was sensation, the ceiling low enough that he had to duck at its center. The walls covered from floor to ceiling in inscription, not carved casually, not carved with any tool he could name. The lines ran at pressures no chisel could maintain across the hundreds of thousands of characters covering every surface. Mathematical, not decorative, not religious, Mathematical, 3 objects in the center of the room. The tablets were obsidian, black as a starless sky, inscribed with characters so fine they only became visible when the torchlight hit them at the precise angle that made them shimmer, cold to the touch, not the cold of the dead, the cold of deep water, of something maintained at exact temperature for exact purpose. The horn was small enough to fit in one hand, bone-like but harder than any bone he had held, harder than antler, harder than boiled leather. One rune circled its circumference, once, twice, 3 times meeting itself without a seam. The third object was a bound document. The binding was neither paper nor leather nor anything the Citadel had catalogued. The writing inside was an old tongue, the language Ned had learned haltingly as a boy, the language all northern children were taught and few adults ever used. He could read it. Slowly, he opened it. The first line read, "These are the warden's rights. For the Stark who finds them, you are late. Begin." He had been reading for the better part of an hour when he heard the footsteps on the stairs. Benjen descended carefully, torch in hand, wearing the black of the night's watch over traveling clothes he hadn't changed since arriving at Winterfell 2 days prior. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked at the chamber. He looked at his brother. He looked at the tablets. He said nothing for a long time. "I couldn't sleep," Benjen said. "I followed your light." "I know." Ned did not look up from the document. Benjen crossed the chamber slowly. He bent to examine the tablets without touching them. He looked at the rune-covered walls. He looked at the horn. Then he sat, in the way a man sits when his legs have made a different decision than his intention, and looked at his brother. Ned set the document down. He met Benjen's eyes. "We are not lords, Ben. We are wardens. Winterfell is not a castle. It is a fortress of the realm. The realm has only ever had one real enemy, and we have spent 8,000 years forgetting what it is." Benjen's expression did not become afraid. It became something more specific than fear. The expression of a man who had been told a story before bed, seriously, in the dark, by a woman who never confused stories and facts, and who was now sitting in the room where the story had been living without him. "The wall still stands, Ned. The Night's Watch, 1,000 men," his voice was flat, "where there should be 10,000, and they speak their vows but they do not say the words that matter, not the Watch's words. These words." He touched the document, the builder's words, the ones that make the oath a real thing rather than a ceremony for a hall. Benjen was quiet. He looked at the tablets again. "What does it want from you?" "It doesn't want anything." Ned picked up the horn, turned it in his hands. "It is a door. It has been waiting for someone with the right blood to open it. And now I have, and I cannot walk past it and pretend I did not." The silence between them had texture. It always had in 30 years of brotherhood. This one was made of tomorrow morning, of the sound a column of southern banners makes on the King's Road when they are still 2 hours out, of a king who had never been told no by a man who loved him. "Robert comes tomorrow," Benjen said. "I know, he will ask you to go south. I know that too." A long pause, the torchlight leaned, and Ned looked at the tablets for the length of time it takes a man to understand what he has already decided, which is different from the time it takes to decide. "And I will tell him no." Benjen let the air out slowly through his nose. He did not argue. He had looked at the walls and the horn and the obsidian, and he had grown up in the same crypts as his brother, and he understood, even without words for it, that some things are not arguments. Some things are simply true. He helped Ned carry the tablets up. The sky was the particular northern gray that lived in the hour before dawn, before color returned to anything, when the world existed in the same charcoal register as smoke and old stone. The great hall was empty. The servants would not rise for another hour. The hearth fire had burned to coals that breathed orange in the gray air. In the corner, in their pen of wooden boards and fresh straw, the 6 direwolf pups were asleep, found less than a week ago, still carrying that newborn clumsiness, all oversized paws and uncoordinated intention. They slept in a pile the way young things sleep, without dignity, without self-consciousness. Ned set the obsidian tablets on the table. All 6 pups stopped, not gradually, all at once in the same precise instant, the way 6 flames go out when a single window opens, bodies still, eyes open, 6 pairs of eyes in 6 different colors, turning to face the same direction, him. Ghost was the one he noticed first, because Ghost was always the one he noticed, the white one, the silent one, the one that had been different from its siblings since the moment they'd found it separate in the snow. Ghost looked at Ned with an attention that had no business existing in something this young, in something that had been alive for less than a fortnight. Not hunger, not play, not the simple animal wanting of a creature learning the world, recognition. All six, open eyes, pointed the same direction, watching with an intelligence that had no business being in animals this small. Ned stood very still. The tablets were warm beneath his hands. The coals breathed in the silence. Outside, in the gray dark before Robert Baratheon's banners crested the King's Road, the first bird of the morning found its voice. The wolves watched him. The tablets breathed heat into his palms. And the north, which had been cold and full of whispers for 8,000 years, leaned in close and waited to see what he would do with what it had given him. The column came through the gates the way it always did in the songs, banners, horses, the particular sound of iron-shod hooves on Winterfell stone that belonged to an army and not a household, the gold of the Lannisters bright against the gray, the crowned stag snapping in the cold, hundreds of men filling the courtyard with the noise and press of a southern world that ate too well and believed in itself completely. Ned stood at the front of his family and watched them arrive and felt nothing he recognized as welcome. The cold was wrong, and he knew it was wrong because he had made it wrong. 3 days of the rites, fragments, the pieces he understood, read aloud in the godswood before dawn while Catelyn slept and the wolves paced the walls. Not the full ceremony. He hadn't the confidence for the full ceremony, not yet. But even the fragments had done something. The air in Winterfell carried a weight it hadn't carried before. The walls were attentive. That was the only word that fit. The castle was paying attention to what passed through it, the way a man pays attention to a sound that is not quite right but cannot yet be named. The southern men felt it and did not know what they felt. He watched it happen. The way riders who had ridden 1,000 miles without flinching from weather or road pulled their cloaks tighter the moment they entered the gates, for no reason. The way horses that had never spooked on the King's Road shied at nothing visible in the corners of the yard. The way even the Lannister knights, armored, proud, professionally oblivious to anything that did not threaten them with a blade, moved slightly closer together once they were inside the walls, as if the instinct for collective warmth had overridden their dignity before they noticed. Then Robert dismounted, and all of it became irrelevant, because Robert's laugh swallowed every other sound in the courtyard. Ned. He crossed the space between them and dragged Ned into an embrace that expressed everything Robert Baratheon had never learned to say with his voice: love and relief and loneliness wearing the shape of enthusiasm. He smelled of road and wine, and the particular warm sweat of a large man who had been in motion for a very long time. He was fatter than the last time. Not soft. Robert's size had never translated into softness, but thick in the way a man gets when his body is still building for wars his life no longer provides. "You're grayer," Robert said. "You look terrible." He was grinning. "And you look like you've been eating the King's Road," Ned said. The laugh again. The yard responded to it the way yards responded to men like Robert. The tension releasing, the smiles spreading through the ranks because the king was pleased, and if the king was pleased then the world was, at least for now, in order. It was Cersei who noticed the wolves. She stood at Robert's left and said nothing, which was her preferred form of communication in the north. Cold courtesy, beautiful and impenetrable, evaluating everything through a frame of relevance to her family's position. She had looked at Catelyn, assessed her, and moved on. She had looked at the Stark children in their line and measured each one for something Ned chose not to name. She had looked at Winterfell's walls and seen stone. Then she looked at the pen in the corner of the yard and stopped looking at everything else. The wolves were too large. That was simply true, less than a fortnight old by any calculation available to the maester, who had examined them twice now and written down numbers that conflicted with themselves. They had the proportions of animals 4 months past weaning. Ghost had stopped fitting through the pen's gate 2 days ago. Ned had not yet told anyone about that. Robert saw them and laughed. "Gods, Ned, are those the pups you ravens about?" "The same. They're not pups. They're bloody siege weapons." He moved toward the pen with the instinctive enthusiasm of a man who had never been afraid of an animal in his life. "Magnificent. Where did you say you found them?" Ned told him. Robert listened with the focused pleasure of a man hearing a good hunting story, which was what it was to him. A northern tale, wolves and winter and good fortune. He reached through the pen's wooden rails and let Ghost sniff his knuckles. Ghost did so with the calm patience of something that had no opinion of Robert Baratheon one way or the other. Cersei did not move. She looked at the wolves from the distance she had chosen, and she did not laugh, and she did not speak, and Ned filed the expression she wore in the place where he kept things that deserved attention later. The feast was the feast. Robert ate, Robert drank, Robert told stories about Robert that grew larger with each cup, and the great hall filled with the performance of joy the way halls fill when a king has decided he is happy and expects his contentment to be shared. The torches in Winterfell's hall were honest northern torches. No perfumed oil, no decorative bronze holders shaped like flowers. They burned straight and threw plain light that made the Lannister gold look excessive and the northern wool look appropriate. Joffrey was bored from the moment he arrived and looking for something to do about it. Ned watched him from the high table, a boy of 12 with his mother's eyes and his grandfather's careful attention to what could be taken. He had been watching the wolves through dinner with the expression of a boy calculating a dare, and somewhere in the third course he stood and wandered toward the pen in the corner of the hall where Ghost had been brought inside. One of his companions said something. Joffrey smiled the way boys smile when they are performing courage for an audience. He crouched in front of the pen's gate. He extended one finger between the rails. Ghost did not growl. Ghost did not show teeth, did not advance, did not register the finger as a threat requiring response. He sat, and he looked at Joffrey, and he applied his full attention to what was in front of him with the unhurried thoroughness of something that had never needed to rush toward a judgment because it had never been wrong about one yet. Joffrey's smile changed, not because he was frightened, because he had expected an animal and received something else. Something that looked at him the way adults very rarely looked at him, cataloging what was there with no warmth in the process, finding the total and doing nothing to conceal it. He stood. He stepped back. He said something to his companion that was meant to sound dismissive, and the companion nodded in the way companions nod when they both know what actually happened. Cersei, from 3 seats down, had not looked away from her son for the 30 seconds any of that took. Ned looked at Ghost. Ghost, as if feeling the weight of attention, turned his head away from Joffrey's retreating back and met Ned's eyes from across the hall. Ned looked back at his plate. I know, he thought. I saw it too. The Lord's chamber held 2 men and a fire large enough to do something about the cold, which in Winterfell was always ambitious. Robert had sent his attendants away. That was the first sign this was not ceremony. Robert kept attendants nearby for ceremony, because ceremony required witnesses. He sat with his cup in both hands and looked at Ned across the table with the expression he'd had since the courtyard, under the performance, wearing it the way a man wears a wound he hasn't admitted to yet. I need a hand, Robert said. That's the plain version. I know. Aaron is gone. The council is full of men who want things from me. I don't trust any of them. He set the cup down. I trust you. I know that too. Robert leaned forward, and for a moment the king in him stepped back and let the other thing forward. The thing that had been Ned Stark's brother in everything since before either of them had the scars they were carrying. I'm in trouble, Ned, not political trouble. He stopped. It's not what I thought it was going to be. His voice had gone quiet in the way large men's voices go quiet when they are saying something they have not said before. The war. After the war I thought, I don't know what I thought, that it would be enough. It was never enough. Robert, I am asking you, not commanding. Asking. Those were different words from this man, and they both knew it. There was no one else. Ned looked at his oldest friend for a long count of seconds. He looked at the fire, he looked at the table, and then he reached beneath it, where he had placed the saddlebag he'd carried up from the crypts, and he removed the obsidian tablet and set it on the table between them. It caught the firelight wrong, not reflecting it, receiving it the way deep water receives light, pulling it down to somewhere it didn't come back from. Robert stared. He reached for it. He stopped hand an inch from the surface and pulled back. It's warm, he said. Yes. How? Ned spoke in old tongue, 3 words, short words, the simplest line of the rites, the one he had practiced until he was certain enough to use it. Not a weapon, a key, something that showed rather than claimed. Every candle in the room went out. Robert was on his feet with his hand on his sword in the same instant, the old reflex perfectly intact under 17 years of feasts and councils and hunting trips. The room was dark for the length of one breath. Then the candles came back, all of them at once burning first blue-white, cold and clean and wrong, before the color drained back to orange one flame at a time, the last one finding orange as the silence settled again. Robert stood with his hand on his sword and his breathing loud in the quiet room, looking at a man sitting at a table in a room that had just done something no room was supposed to do. Maester's trick, he said. His voice was not steady. No. Then what? The long night is coming. Ned's voice was level, not dramatic, presenting facts to a man who needed them. Not winter, not the season. The others are real. They have always been real. My family has always known they were real, and we forgot, and that is on us. Bran the Builder raised the wall to hold them, and he left instructions in my crypts for when it needed to be done again. We are not lords of the North, Robert. We are its wardens, its jailers, and the jail has been unmanned for 8,000 years. Robert sat. It was not a graceful motion. Ned, I cannot go south. There is nothing in the south worth dying for. He said it cleanly, without apology. The way he said all the true things, plainly, once, as if additional words would insult the truth by suggesting it required decoration. There is everything in the north worth living for. The silence lasted long enough to have weight. You're choosing dead men and old magic over your king. I am choosing my children over a throne room in a city that doesn't know what's coming for it. Robert looked at the candles, at the tablet, at his ale, which he had not touched. He stood without speaking, which was unusual enough in Robert Baratheon that Ned registered it as its own kind of statement. He walked to the door. He did not slam it. The door closed behind him with a click that was quieter than the one in the crypts, and quieter somehow was worse. Catelyn was waiting in the corridor. She had the look of a woman who had not moved from that spot for the length of a difficult conversation, posture too still, hands too quiet. The voices through the door would not have given her words. They would have given her enough. You heard, Ned said. Some. Her eyes went to the tablet in his hands. She reached for it the way she reached for most things, with the practical confidence of a woman who had managed a household and a lord and 5 children and believed that most things could be handled if you engaged with them directly. Her hand touched the obsidian. She pulled back as if burned, though nothing burned her. She pressed her hand flat against her own chest instead, palm over her heart, and looked at the tablet with an expression Ned had never seen on her face before in 11 years of marriage. Not fear exactly, the recognition of a thing that was real in a way she had not prepared for. It's alive, Ned. Barely above a whisper. Yes. What is it? He looked at it in his hands. 8,000 years of waiting made solid, made cold, made patient, made suddenly undeniably his problem. The warden's rights begin tonight. He said. Catelyn looked at him for a long time. Her husband, whose face she had learned to read the way you learn the specific language of a specific country, not just the words but the grammar beneath the words. She saw what was in it now, not certainty, because she had been married to him long enough to know that certainty was not a thing he wore, something older than certainty, the settled look of a man who has been handed a purpose that fits exactly the space in him that nothing else had filled. You've been waiting for this, she said. No. He was quiet for a moment, but I was made for it. He looked at the tablet. I think I always was. Down the corridor, somewhere in the guest chambers, a door slammed. Robert finally finding a wall that could absorb what he didn't have words for. Neither of them moved. Robert did not look back at the gates. Ned watched the column until the gold of the banners dissolved into the gray of the King's Road, and the sound of 1,000 horses became nothing. And the particular quality of silence that follows a large thing's departure settled over Winterfell like the first snow of a season that has been coming for a long time. The guards at the gate relaxed their posture in the incremental way men relax when they have been performing straightness for days. The servants moved differently, their own rhythms returning, the castle finding its breath again. Ned stood for another moment after the road was empty. Then he turned to his children. All of them, Jon included. He had been specific about Jon when he sent word to the household that morning, specific in a way that had made Catelyn's expression do something complicated, because Ned was never specific about Jon in the way that required justification. The children were assembled in the yard with the particular energy of young people who have been told something significant is happening and have been given no further information, which is its own kind of torment. Robb stood straight and tried to look as though he was not burning to ask questions. Arya had abandoned trying to look anything in particular, and was simply watching her father's face with the directness that had been her primary mode of engagement since she learned to look at things. Bran stood very still beside Summer, whose head was already level with Bran's shoulder. Jon stood slightly apart, as he always stood in family arrangements, the distance so habitual it had become invisible to everyone except him. The gods would, Ned said. All of you. The heart tree had always been old. That was the fact about the gods wood that Ned had grown up with and had never found a better way to hold. It was old in a way that exceeded the language available for oldness. The face carved into the pale bark had been carved so long ago that the expression it wore had been shaped by hands nobody could name, using tools nobody had catalogued, for reasons that the intervening years had compressed into the single-word tradition, which was what people called reasons they had stopped understanding. The red sap ran more freely this morning. Not dramatically, no theatrical bleeding, no supernatural quantity. Just more than usual, finding the channels carved by that unknown hand with a new enthusiasm, as if something in the tree had been told the day had come and had been making itself ready since before dawn. Ned knelt at the base of the tree. He opened the rights to the page he had marked. The words were in old tongue, the language of the first men, the language of the Starks before the Andals brought their Seven and their Valyrian-inflected script. Ned spoke it haltingly as a boy, and with slightly less haltingness now, after 4 days of reading. The words were not beautiful. That was the thing he had not expected. Rhaegar Targaryen's people had made their magic in poetry and song and the studied emotional architecture of High Valyrian. These words were not that. They were functional. They read like specifications, like a man who had built something very large and important writing down, for the person who would need to build it again, exactly what the dimensions were and why. He spoke them quietly, not a recitation but a report, delivering information to something that had been waiting to receive it. The carved face watched, the sap moved, the children stood in a loose circle at the tree's perimeter, their wolves at their feet, and the godswood held the sound of Ned's voice and did not let it echo, it simply kept it. Bran moved before anyone understood what he was doing. He was 7 years old, and he had the particular quality of attention that his family called dreaminess, and Maester Luwin called distraction, and that was in fact neither of those things. It was the quality of a mind that was listening to something in an adjacent frequency, always at low volume, and occasionally the volume shifted. His hand went to the bark of the heart tree, not to steady himself, not deliberately. His hand moved, and then his hand was touching the tree, and then everything else stopped. His eyes went white. Not the white of a man losing consciousness, not the roll of a fainting body. They went white the way a sky goes white before a storm that has been building for a long time finally arrives. Summer went perfectly still, not frozen, still in the way that still is a choice and not an absence. 15 seconds. When Bran came back, his eyes were his eyes again, and his expression was the expression of someone who has just stood somewhere very large and come back to somewhere very small, and is still adjusting to the dimensions. "It knows we're here now," he said. His voice was different, not deeper, not older, just more certain than a 7-year-old's voice had the structural equipment to be. "It's always known, but it's been waiting for us to know too." A pause. He looked at his father. "The heart of winter is cold, father. It's so cold. But it's not empty." He said it very carefully, the way you say a thing that needs to land exactly. "It's been waiting, and it knows we mean to fight." He did not fall. He did not buckle or reach for the tree to steady himself. He stood where he had been standing and breathed the godswood air, and looked like a boy who had just been given a task that fit him precisely, and would now, without particular ceremony, begin performing it. Nymeria pressed into Arya's legs hard enough to move a grown man. Arya did not move. Her feet found the ground differently. Weight dropping, knees bending slightly, the automatic adjustment of a body that suddenly understood balance as a more serious proposition than it had been the moment before. Her eyes went amber, not white like Bran's. Amber, the gold brown of a wolf's gaze at dusk, full of a specific kind of intelligence that was looking out from behind her face rather than from within it. 3 seconds. Then she was back. "I can hear them," Arya said. She sounded less surprised than she should have. She sounded, if anything, the way she sounded when she found something she had been looking for without knowing she'd lost it. Hundreds of them, south and east and west and north, all of them running. She looked at her hands, turned them over. "I can feel all of them at once." She said the last part the way she might say she had found a coin she'd assumed was gone. "They're all mine." Jon fell to his knees. Not from faintness. His body hit the ground in the way a body hits the ground when the thing inside it has temporarily gone somewhere else and left the physical structure to manage on its own, which it did with reasonable competence, but without elegance. Ghost did not move. Ghost stood with all 4 feet on the godswood floor, and his red eyes open and something moving behind them that was too large for the red-eyed face of a direwolf pup, too organized, too deliberate, too aware of being watched from the inside by someone who had just arrived. 30 seconds. Jon's hands gripped the earth. His face cycled through expressions the way a face cycles through expressions when the input arriving is far beyond the instrument's calibrated range. The mouth opening, the jaw tightening, the brow doing 3 separate things in 2 seconds. His breathing was too fast and then not fast enough, and then too fast again. Then he came back. He sat on his heels in the dirt of the godswood, and he wept. Not dramatically, not the weeping of grief or pain, the weeping of overwhelming volume, the involuntary response of a body that has encountered something it had no prepared container for, and is manufacturing the container in real time. "It's so loud," he said. He pressed the back of one hand against his eyes. "Everything is so loud out there, every sound, every smell." He stopped. He collected himself with the particular discipline of a boy who had trained himself not to display the things that cost him. When he looked up, his eyes were his own, and the weeping had stopped. How does he walk through the world like this all the time? Ghost, across the circle, sat down. His red eyes found Jon's. Patient, fond, in the alien way of something that does not experience fondness the way humans do, but experiences something that occupies the same space. Grey wind circled Robb twice. Robb stood very still at the center of the circle, eyes open, tracking the wolf with a kind of focused attention that looked like concentration but felt, to the people watching, like listening. He did not go rigid. He did not go amber or white. He simply went quiet in the way that Robb Stark, who was almost never quiet, very rarely went quiet, and the quality of it made the godswood feel slightly smaller. Then, "There are riders on the King's Road." He said it calmly, with the offhand confidence of a man reporting what he can see. 3 of them, fast horses. One of them is afraid. He blinked, looked at his father. I don't know how I know that." Ned looked at him steadily. "You know it through Grey Wind." Robb absorbed this. He looked at the wolf who had settled beside him with the posture of a creature that had made a decision about where it stood and intended to remain there. "Can I do it again? As often as you need to," Ned said. "You'll want to practice controlling when." The Raven arrived an hour later. 3 outriders from the Eastern Watch, riding hard, one of them with an arrow wound in his shoulder from a ranging party that had seen something in the wolfswood that was an animal. Robb read the message and said nothing. He looked at his father. Ned nodded once. Sansa had not moved from the stone bench, where she sat with Lady's head in her lap. She stroked the fur with the steady rhythm of a girl who had been doing this since Lady arrived. And Lady had been doing this since she arrived too, pressing into Sansa with a specific gravity, a specific intention of closeness that exceeded what warmth or comfort explained. Her awakening looked, from the outside, like nothing. No white eyes, no amber, no falling. Sansa sat with her hand moving through Lady's fur and her expression unchanged and her gaze drifting, almost imperceptibly, toward the doorway of the godswood. A servant had appeared there. A woman who managed the guest chambers, who had been managing the guest chambers since Robert's column arrived, who had spent 5 days in close proximity to Cersei Lannister and her household. Sansa said, "She's been frightened of us since Robert arrived." Her voice was quiet, thoughtful, picking up something it was turning over carefully before speaking. Not of the wolves. Of us. A pause. Her hand kept moving. "And she's been writing letters she won't let her handmaids see." Ned looked at his eldest daughter. Sansa met his gaze. Her expression was the expression of a girl who does not yet know what she has, only that she has something new, and that it arrived the way feelings arrive. Suddenly and completely true, without a point of entry she could identify. Was I supposed to know that?" "Not before today," Ned said quietly. Shaggy Dog bolted at the ceremony's peak and took the eastern wall at a run with Rickon on his heels. Rickon, who was 4 years old and had no business keeping pace with anything moving that quickly. And yet, they were found at dawn. Rickon was asleep against the castle's outer wall, curled against the stone with his cheek on his arm and no memory of the night he had spent outside. He was unharmed. He was warm, which the temperature of the night did not account for. The tracks in the mud around the full perimeter of Winterfell's outer wall were from something large. They were fresh. They circled the castle at a spacing that suggested a patrol, the same route repeated through the dark, again and again, all night long. The tracks belonged to Shaggy Dog. Nobody said what that meant. Ned pulled Jon aside near the godswood's edge, while the others went back to the castle. The conversation was brief, because the things that needed saying did not require length. "You are not going to the wall as a recruit," Ned said. "You are going as my first ranger, the commander of the warg cell." Jon's expression did not ask the question, The question lived in his eyes and stayed there. I need your eyes where mine cannot reach. Bran sees from above. Arya sees through the pack. You are the ground truth. Ned looked at his nephew, his sister's son, the living consequence of a promise he had carried for 15 years like a stone that had become so familiar he had forgotten it was heavy. You go where I need to know. Jon looked at him, at the combination of love and grief and something that was not quite awe but occupied the same place. And he had the quality which he had always had of a young man who knew there were questions he was not yet ready for the answers to. He did not ask. He would. There would be time. Old Nan stood in the doorway of the Godswood. She had been there for some portion of the ceremony and some portion of what came before it. She had lived in Winterfell longer than anyone could establish with certainty, longer than any single person in the castle could remember the beginning of, which was its own kind of evidence. She watched Ned with the tablets. She watched the children and their wolves. She watched all of it with the expression of a woman who was hearing a story confirmed that she had always known was a story, in the sense that stones are stories, recording what actually happened in the material of the thing itself. She nodded once, to no one in particular. "Aye," she said. A pause. The Godswood moved around her, leaves and cold air and the red-sapped silence of the heart tree. About time. Nobody asked her what she meant. They never did with old Nan, and the reason was not impoliteness, but something more instinctive. Some answers are waiting in the asking, and the people around her had always known, without knowing how they knew, that she would not waste the words. She was never wrong. Mikken did not ask questions the way educated men ask questions. He asked them the way a man asks questions when he is trying to understand the specifications of a job, practically in sequence, with the kind of focused economy that 30 years of shaping iron had built into him the way iron builds into the hands that work it. He was a large man, made larger by his work, with forearms that carried the particular topography of a body that had spent its life in close conversation with heavy objects. He had shod horses and mended gates and made the swords that the Stark household carried. He had never been asked to do this. He listened to Ned without interruption. Ned laid the copies he'd made of the relevant tablets, not the originals, which had not left the blood vault since he'd removed them, and which he had placed back 2 nights ago with the feeling of returning something borrowed, on the workbench beside the forge. He had spent 4 days working the translation. The specifications in the rites were not mystical. They were engineering, written by a man who had built the largest structure in the known world, and understood that the people who would read his instructions later would need them to be exact. Iron from northern deposits only, the ore from the mines at Deepwood, from the rills, from the veins in the hills north of Hornwood, not trade iron, not the iron that came up the King's Road from the Westerosi market, which had been mixed with southern ore across 100 years of commerce, until it carried dilutions that the rites did not specify, but the rites' logic implied were wrong in ways that mattered. Northern iron from northern stone, as it had come out of the ground, here, specifically, in this latitude, in this particular quality of cold, weirwood coal instead of regular charcoal. Mikken had stopped at that one, weirwood coal. He repeated it without inflection. Weirwood burns, yes. Weirwood is sacred. Men don't. Fallen branches, Ned said. The Godswood drops them every storm. I've had them collected for a fortnight. He paused. No living tree is cut. Mikken absorbed this. He looked at the copy of the tablet with the expression of a man reading instructions he does not fully understand but respects because the source has demonstrated competence in areas he can verify. And the quench. Deep channel water from the hot springs. The channel that runs closest to the castle's oldest foundation stones. Not the surface channel, the deep one. It comes up colder than it should from that depth. Mikken looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once and picked up the tablet copy and began to read it himself. Slowly, with the focused attention he gave to tolerances and measurements. He did not say anything else until he was satisfied he understood the task. Then he said, "Tomorrow morning, then. First forge." The weirwood coal burned wrong. That was the first thing Mikken said when Ned arrived at the forge before dawn. He said it without alarm, the statement of a craftsman noting a deviation that he had catalogued but not yet classified. The coal burned cold blue, not the yellow-orange of regular charcoal, not the white-blue of an extremely hot conventional burn. Cold blue, the color of the sky in the last moment before full dark, steady and constant at a temperature that the color should not have represented, and that his thermometer, a long rod of measured metal he'd used for 20 years, read as impossible for what the visible flame suggested. "How is it?" Ned asked. "Wrong," Micken said. "In a way that works. The metal went into the coal heat and came out behaving differently than iron had behaved in Micken's experience, which was extensive and which he trusted. It moved with a willingness. It did not resist the hammer the way iron resisted, not from softness but from something else, some quality of the heat or the ore or the combination of the two that had produced a metal that seemed, as he worked, to be moving toward a shape it had already determined. He was guiding it rather than forcing it, which was not what iron did. Iron needed forcing. This iron suggested. He inscribed the first rune 40 minutes into the work. He set the chisel against the blade. The chisel found the line before he applied pressure. He applied pressure anyway because he was a man who trusted his hands more than his eyes in the forge, and his hands confirmed it. The chisel was not finding resistance. It was finding a groove that was already beginning to exist, as if the metal recognized the mark that was being made on it, and was meeting the tool halfway. He said nothing about that. He finished the rune. He moved to the next one. The first blade came out in 4 hours. He held it over the quench trough, where the deep channel water sat in a stone basin still cool from its source below the castle's oldest stones. The water smelled different from the surface springs, mineral and deep and old, carrying the faint warmth of the earth's center that the rites described without explanation, and that Maester Luwin had attributed, twice in Ned's presence, to natural volcanic activity far below. The blade went in. The sound it made was wrong. Not the violent hiss of normal iron quenching, something quieter, a settling, like a thing returning to a state it had been removed from temporarily. Micken pulled it out and held it up, and the blade was colder than it should be. Not cold from the water, cold in a way that radiated outward rather than inward, as if the quench had not drawn heat out but put something in. He struck it against the anvil edge. Once, the tone it produced traveled through the forge floor and up through the soles of Ned's boots and into his legs before it reached his ears. Not a ring, a note, specific, clean, wrong in the way that was beginning to feel less like wrongness and more like a quality he did not yet have the vocabulary for. Micken set it on the workbench. He looked at it. He looked at Ned. "That's not just a sword," he said. "No," Ned said. The stone room in the lower level of the castle had been sealed with 3 iron bars and a maester's wax seal that Luwin had applied personally, at Ned's instruction when the Night's Watch Rangers arrived 12 days ago. The Rangers themselves had refused to return north. They sat in the garrison hall and ate and did not speak about what they had seen, which was a specificity of trauma that Ned recognized as honest. He broke the seal himself. He lifted the bars. He opened the door. The smell was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with decay. Decay was organic. This was the smell of something that existed in a category adjacent to the living without belonging to it, the cold and the stillness of a stopped thing, a body that had been given motion again from outside itself, from something that was not life. The white had been a ranging brother, middle-aged, from the look of what remained of his face. It moved when the door opened, responding to the presence of living warmth, the way it had been responding since the Rangers had it in the cart on the King's Road. Lurching, reaching, fingers closing on air with a persistence that had no intelligence in it, only appetite. Ned closed the door behind him. He held the shatter steel blade at his side. He crossed the room in 4 steps and cut. The white did not fall slowly. The animation in it, whatever the walkers had put there in place of the thing that had left when the man died, extinguished at the point of contact, traveled outward from the blade's line through the body in the time it takes a candle to go out when the draft hits it right. The body dropped. The blade frosted over. Ice crystals formed along its full length in under 2 seconds. Not a rime, not surface condensation, but structured ice, growing in the geometric patterns of the runes inscribed along the flat. Ned watched them form. He waited. The crystals held for 9 seconds, then began to melt from the crossguard outward, dripping cold water onto the stone floor, until the blade was bare metal again, cooling to room temperature. He walked out of the room. He pulled the door shut. He carried the sword back to the forge and set it on the workbench in front of Micken. 200 more, he said. Micken picked up his hammer. Maester Luwin had his objection prepared. Ned could tell by the way the maester stood when he arrived at the tower, the posture of a man who has organized his thinking and is waiting for the moment to deploy it. Luwin was not a bad man. He was a man whose training had produced a mind of specific quality, ordered, empirical, resistant to conclusions that exceeded the available evidence. The available evidence had been exceeding itself for 12 days, and Lewin had been adjusting his thresholds for it with the controlled discomfort of a craftsman working in a material he had not apprenticed for. He waited until Ned had removed his cloak and sat. Then, "My lord, we have sufficient northern iron from the identified deposits for approximately 200 blades of the specified composition. The full northern levy fields 10,000 men-at-arms, with bannermen capable of raising 15,000 in wartime." He paused precisely. 200 shatter steel blades represents less than 2% of any force we could field. "Yes," Ned said. Lewin waited for more. "When it didn't come, that is not a strategic weapon. That is a specialized unit." "It is exactly a specialized unit," Ned said. He moved to the map table. It was a large table, the map covering it made by 3 maesters over 40 years of careful drafting. Every castle in the north, every holdfast, every godswood and standing stone and ancient fortification marked in precise ink. "We don't need 10,000 shatter steel blades, Lewin. We need 100. He touched the map. "Winterfell first. The remaining forces carry fire and dragonglass, and the knowledge of what they are fighting, and we need the walls. My lord, every castle in the north, every watchtower, every godswood that has a weirwood tree, every standing stone circle the first men raised on the stony shore, every ancient ring on the flint cliffs, every barrow in the barrowlands." His finger moved across the map as he named them, touching each point, not randomly but in sequence, south to north, west to east, following a pattern that Lewin could not yet see the logic of. They are warding nodes. Every one of them, part of a network that Bran the Builder installed across the entire North 8,000 years ago, and that nobody has activated since. Lewin was quiet. "We don't need to build the defense," Ned said. "We need to turn it on." The silence in the room had the quality of a man reordering a very large amount of information very quickly. Lewin looked at the map. He looked at the points Ned's finger had touched. He began slowly to see the pattern in them. Not random ancient sites, not the accumulated debris of preandal superstition, but nodes, connections, the architecture of something deliberately placed across a vast geography with a precision that could not be accidental, and that he had been cataloging as coincidence for 20 years without asking why they coincided. "You've been reading those tablets since you found them," Lewin said. Ned nodded. "Every night this week, before dawn." Another nod. Lewin looked at the map for a long time, at the marked points, at the pattern he could now not unsee. "How long have you been planning this?" Ned looked at the map, at the thing it was becoming in front of him, not a record of geography but a schematic of a weapon, waiting, distributed across the entire north in a form so large that nobody had recognized it as a weapon because nobody had stood far enough back to see its shape. "Since the moment I understood what they said," he said. Lewin sat down. He did not say anything else for a long time, which was, from Lewin, its own kind of concession. Outside the tower window, the forge burned cold blue against the early dark. Micken's hammer rang out across the yard, that specific, wrong, too deep note that carried farther than iron should carry. The sound moved through the stone of Winterfell the way sound moved through the warding network Ned was beginning to understand, purposefully, without echo, as if the castle itself was listening and finding, after a very long silence, that it approved. The letter from Cersei arrived at Casterly Rock 14 days after Robert's column returned from the north. Tywin Lannister read it once at his desk in the hour before dawn, in the room he used for correspondence that required privacy, which was a different room from the one he used for correspondence that required the appearance of openness. He read it with the focused stillness of a man whose face had long since stopped being a reliable indicator of what was happening behind it. When he finished, he set it flat on the desk and sat for a moment, in the way he sat when he was doing arithmetic. Then he picked up his quill and began his reply. It was not a long letter. Tywin Lannister's letters were never long, because he wrote in conclusions. The conclusions here were 3. First, Eddard Stark's refusal of the handship was a political event regardless of the justification offered, and political events required political responses proportional to their implications. Second, the justification offered, ancient magic crypts, the long night, was irrelevant to the political event. A lord who refused the crown's summons while citing mysticism was performing rebellion whether or not he used the word. Third, the precedent could not stand. If Stark faced no consequence, every lord in the 7 kingdoms received implicit permission to refuse the next royal summons with an equally mystical excuse. And the authority of the Iron Throne, which was in practice the authority of House Lannister at this particular moment in history, would mean correspondingly less. He did not write about the magic. He never wrote about things he could not quantify. He wrote, "Begin with the Riverlands. The Tully Alliance is the Stark Alliance's southern route. Cut it." He sealed the letter. He did not read it again. The small council chamber in the Red Keep smelled of beeswax candles and the particular anxiety of men who served a king they could not predict. Robert had returned from the north, diminished in a way that none of them had vocabulary for. Not physically. He was the same large, loud, appetite-driven presence he had always been, the same man who ate too much and drank more than that and laughed at volume in rooms designed for quiet. But something in him had contracted. He sat at the head of the council table and signed documents and approved expenditures and granted audiences, and he did all of it with the mechanical competence of a man performing functions whose meaning had become obscure to him. He had lost something in the north. None of them knew what it was. Cersei watched him the way she watched all valuable things that had become unreliable, with the patience of someone already preparing the contingency. Varys spoke first, as he usually did when the information was delicate. "My little birds have been busy in the north." He folded his hands on the table with the gentle precision of a man handling objects he preferred not to drop. "The forge in Winterfell has been operating at unusual hours, daily before first light. Northern blacksmiths are being contracted from villages across 3 castellanes at wages significantly above the regional rate for skilled labor." A pause. "The direwolves have grown to a size that I find difficult to convey with appropriate precision. My source's letter uses the word impossible 3 times in one sentence, which I take as a form of emphasis rather than despair. Cersei, blacksmiths, and something else." Varys's voice remained at the same pleasant, unhurried register it occupied for everything from trade disputes to treason. Strange lights from the godswood. At night, ravens between Winterfell and Greywater watch at a frequency that suggests ongoing correspondence of some substance. And, a small pause that was not for effect, but for accuracy, the Lady of Winterfell appeared to have touched one of the northern objects and reacted as though it caused her pain. My source was observing from a distance. She reports Lady Stark pressed her hand to her chest and stepped back, which is, I acknowledge, a narrow data point. But narrow data points accumulate. "The maester's tricks Robert described," Jaime said from the wall where he stood guard. He said it with the tone of a man who was not quite certain he believed what he was saying. Possibly. Varys looked at the table. Or possibly Lord Stark has found something in his crypts that he is using with increasing competence, and the question we have not asked is whether we would prefer he use it against us, or against whatever he believes is coming from beyond the wall. He said this with the clarity of a man presenting a calculation he knows will not be performed. "The Night's Watch has been sending ravens south with concerning frequency. 12 in the past month. The content of most has been sealed and delivered to the Red Keep directly. Ghost stories," Cersei said. "The Night's Watch sends ghost stories south every winter. The ravens carry a specific word, my lady, repeatedly. The same word in 12 separate correspondences from 12 separate rangers." The table waited. Varys, others. Nobody spoke. The candles burned in the silence. Then Littlefinger shifted his weight in his chair and turned his cup in one hand and said, "If Stark has declared himself Magician King of the North, the financial implications for crown revenues from northern grain levies are interesting." He said this with the mild engagement of a man who found most things interesting when they had financial implications. Specifically for the lenders currently financing the Crown's existing debt, who will want to know whether the North represents a diminishing revenue base or an Lord Baelish, Cersei said. She said only the name. He stopped. She looked at the table, at the documents on it, at the window that showed the red and gold of King's Landing's morning without caring what it showed them. She was already past the small council. She was already in Casterly Rock with her father's letter, in the conversation she had been having with him through ravens for a fortnight, in the conclusion that the small council was a room where things were discussed, and Tywin Lannister's study was a room where things were decided. She said, "Write to Sir Gregor." The mountain moved through the Riverlands the way the mountain always moved through places, efficiently, without variation, applying maximum force to each objective in sequence before advancing to the next. He had done this before. He understood that the burning of Tully-adjacent villages was a message with a specific recipient, and that the villages themselves were the medium, not the point. He arrived at the first village on his list to find it empty, not abandoned in panic. The kind of emptiness that panic leaves is legible in what it leaves behind. Clothing on the floor, food left on fires, the debris of interrupted lives. This emptiness was orderly. The villagers and their animals and their portable food stores were simply gone. relocated, as if someone had known 3 days in advance which direction to send them and had had the organizational capacity to send them there without disorder. He burned what remained, he moved to the next. Empty, the third village had people in it, a dozen old men who were too stubborn to leave and a dog. They looked at the mountain's company with the particular expression of men who are not afraid because they have already accepted the situation, which is different from courage and more unsettling. They did not know where the others had gone, they said. They had simply gone. The mountain accepted this because old men who accept their situation generally tell the truth. He burned the village. The old men watched. The supply wagons began losing wheels on the 4th day. Not all at once, one at a time, on roads that scouts had reported as intact, at intervals irregular enough to resist the conclusion of deliberate sabotage, but frequent enough to slow the column by half. The physician's stores in the second wagon were contaminated in a way that took 4 days to diagnose, during which time the wound infections in 3 men progressed to a point that cost one of them his hand. The messenger pigeons in the command tent were gone one morning. Not killed. Gone, the cage open, the birds absent, no evidence of entry through the tent's sealed flaps. The mountain was not a man of imagination. He was a man of force, and force worked against things that could be forced. He was encountering things that could not be found. An enemy you cannot find cannot be fought, which was a problem that fell outside his considerable range of competencies, and he communicated this through letters that became, over the following 2 weeks, progressively less detailed and progressively more expensive in their implications. The Ravens reached King's Landing with the quality of dispatches from a campaign that is losing a war it cannot see. Robert signed the declaration on a Tuesday evening in the 3rd week of the column's return. Cersei had chosen Tuesday deliberately. She had chosen the evening deliberately. She had chosen the particular vintage in the cup deliberately, and the positioning of the document beneath 3 other documents he had already signed, and the specific words she used in the 3 sentences she spoke before he reached it. None of this required sophistication. It required the accumulated knowledge of 17 years of study, which was what her marriage had been in the end. A long study in the management of one specific man's predictable weaknesses. He did not read it carefully. He had never read documents carefully. That was what she was for, he had said once, in the early years, meaning it as a compliment about her capability, not recognizing what he was building with it. His signature was large and slightly uneven, the way it was in the evenings. She blotted it. She let the wax dry. She carried it to her chambers and set it in the correspondence box with her father's last letter, and the dispatches from the Riverlands and the Varys intelligence report, and the 3 sealed Night's Watch ravens that she had redirected before they reached Robert, because men who were already behaving strangely did not benefit from ghost stories, and Cersei Lannister had not come this far by giving people information that complicated the arithmetic. The declaration meant Stark was a traitor. What it did not mean was that anyone could reach him. That was a problem she would address when the Riverlands campaign produced a result worth addressing. She was patient. She had always been patient when patience was the correct tool, which it almost always was, which was the thing that people who thought of her as merely ambitious reliably failed to understand about her. She did not think about the candles going out. She had not thought about the candles going out since Robert told her the story, drunk on the 2nd night back. She thought about it now, once, briefly. Then she put it away and went to sleep. 20,000 men make a specific sound. Not the sound of individual soldiers or even companies. Something larger than that. A collective noise produced by the convergence of iron and leather and horses, and the machinery of supply that follows an army the way a shadow follows a body. It was a professional sound. The sound of the best-equipped fighting force in Westeros, moving with the organized confidence of men who had won the last war and had every reason to expect to win this one. Kavan Lannister rode at the column's head and did not allow himself satisfaction, because satisfaction was what men felt before things went wrong, and he had been a soldier long enough to know that the distance between confidence and complacency was shorter than it looked from the inside. He was 60 years old and had served his brother's house with the unglamorous competence of a man who understood that the useful work of any family was done by the person nobody wrote songs about. He had counted the force carefully, 20,000. Cavalry, infantry, siege equipment for a ruined fortress that intelligence described as 3 towers and loose stone. Supplies for 6 weeks. Lannister gold paying for Lannister professionalism at every level of the column. Sir Gregor rode in the van. The mountain's presence was a tactical asset in the specific way that irreversible things are assets, useful precisely because there was no question about its application. The men behind him rode straighter. The men ahead of him, theoretically, ran. The causeway was solid beneath their feet, the road north was clear and straight, and the autumn sky above it was cloudless, and the intelligence from the riverlands had been consistent. The north was rearming, the forge was busy, ravens flew between Winterfell and the Neck at unusual frequency. None of this changed the arithmetic. An army of 20,000 did not require the north to be unprepared, it required the north to be present. Kayvon was not thinking about magic, he was thinking about supply lines and tower height and the width of a siege approach in variable terrain. These were the correct things to think about. He stopped thinking about them when they entered the Neck. The mist arrived without announcement. Not fog. Kayvon had ridden through fog on 100 mornings, knew its texture and its logic, how it sat in low ground and burned with the sun, and moved with predictable slowness. This was different in quality. It came from no direction he could identify, arriving with a completeness that suggested it had been waiting rather than traveling. It settled at chest height on the horses and did not thin as the morning advanced. The torches he ordered lit burned in it without penetrating it. They made halos. The halos did not help. The scouts he sent off the causeway on either side did not return. Not immediately, he gave them time, because the next terrain was difficult, and men moved through difficult terrain with difficulty. He gave them an hour. He sent a second pair to find the first. The second pair did not return either. He pulled the flanking scouts back to the causeway and tightened the formation and ordered slower advance, which was the correct response, and accomplished nothing. "We're blind," the lead scout reported. His voice had a quality Kevin recognized and did not like. The controlled register of a professional soldier, managing something he could not explain, and therefore could not address. "Blind and deaf, my lord. The ravens won't." He stopped. "They won't fly north. We sent 3 ahead to Castle Black for the standard position report. All 3 came back within the hour. They wouldn't fly north. Ravens flew north in any weather. Ravens flew north in the dark. Ravens were not afraid of terrain or weather or reasonable threats to their persons." Kevin filed this information in the place he kept information that altered assessments and said, "Form the column tighter. Keep torches doubled. Advance at half pace." He did these things. They accomplished nothing. Benjen met them at the gate. He had changed across the year since Winterfell. Not physically, not aged, but organized differently in the way men organize themselves when the thing they have been preparing for stops being preparation and becomes operational. He was the commander of the Night's Watch in a way that the Watch had not had a commander in a generation. Not a lord performing a duty he was assigned, but a man running an institution he understood from its foundation to its purpose, who had spent 12 months re-swearing his brothers with the correct oaths in the correct order, and drilling them in the knowledge of what they were actually guarding against. He looked at the host. 15,000 men filling the King's Road from the castle's gate to the vanishing point of sight. "This is the largest force to come to the wall since the last long night," he said. "Yes," Ned said. Benjen nodded once. "Then it seems appropriate." He pulled the gate wide. "Jon's been here 2 weeks. He's been waiting for you." Jon had not slept in 2 days. He was not agitated, not the wired, frantic state of a man running on too little rest and too much urgency. He was the opposite. Completely still at the map table in the commander's tower. Ghost beside him, the rights open to the sections he had read until the pages carried the particular worn quality of text that has been handled by hands that needed it. He looked up when Ned entered. He looked at his father the way he looked at things he had been thinking about for a long time in solitude and was now ready to discuss. The wall was not built to hold them, Jon said. No preamble. He had learned Ned's language over 19 years. That is what it became. That is not what the builder made it for. He laid his hand on the section of the rights marked with the strip of leather he used for the passages he returned to most. It is a lens, a focusing instrument. Every warding node in the north, every godswood, every runestone, every node Bran mapped from Bear Island to the Barrowlands, they feed into it. The wall is the output. He looked at Ned. The north is the power source. The assembled commanders, Benjen, Robb, the northern lords who had ridden, looked at the map, then at Jon, then at the wall through the tower window where the massing dark beyond it had been visible since the column's arrival, as a quality of the northern horizon, a depth of black that exceeded the normal depth of night. "We don't hold the wall," Jon said. "We make the wall reach." They arrived before dawn on the 3rd day. The haunted forest to the north filled, in the gray hour before light, from tree line to tree line, with a mass that was not animal and not human, and not the darkness itself but occupied the same space as darkness occupies, covering the ground with the complete and patient thoroughness of something that has no urgency, because urgency is a property of things that can run out of time. Tens of thousands. The whites moved with the collective motion of a tide, not intelligent, not coordinated in the way an army is coordinated, but consistent in the way that water is consistent, moving in the direction of the thing they were aimed at, because they had been aimed and had not been stopped. Between them, slower and more deliberate, the White Walkers moved the way cold moves through stone, without haste, without variation, already at their destination in some sense that preceded arrival. The Night King was visible at a mile, not because he was large or elevated or marked by any spectacle. He was visible because the air around him behaved differently than air behaved anywhere else on the field. The cold he carried was not the cold of the night, or the cold of the dead, or the cold that the strange early winter had brought. It was the cold of a decision made 8,000 years ago and never rescinded, concentrated, intentional, the temperature of something ancient enough to have stopped being metaphor and become physics. On the wall, 15,000 men in the Night's Watch stood and looked at the thing they had come here to face. Nobody spoke. Some men prayed, most simply looked, the way men look at the thing they have been told about and have agreed to face, and are now facing and are discovering that agreement and confrontation are different states of the same intention. Jon raised the warden's horn. It was small in his hand. It had always seemed too small for what the rites said it was, a thing that looked like it belonged on a hunting trip, bone-carved and unadorned except for the single rune that circled its circumference without seam. He set it to his lips. The note it produced had no business coming from something this size. It did not travel through air. It traveled through stone, through the wall's base, through the ancient foundation where Bran the Builder had pressed his blood into the first carvings 8,000 years ago, through the earth itself, moving outward through the runic network at a depth that surface sound never reached. The wall trembled, not the ice, the stone. The foundation shuddering with the recognition of a frequency it had been calibrated to receive and had been waiting to receive, and was now, after 8,000 years, receiving. The trembling moved south, fast, through the root channels, through the earth, through the deep rock that connected every warding node in the north in a grid laid 3,000 feet below the surface. Every godswood in the north blazed blue-white simultaneously, from Winterfell's heart tree to the small grove on Bear Island to the half-dead tree in the rills that Bran had identified and Ned had warded in the 4th week of the council. The runestones at Moat Cailin pulsed with the light at their mortar lines, bright enough to be visible from the ramparts. 300 miles south, the hot springs beneath Winterfell surged upward through the channels in the castle walls, and the walls of the empty castle glowed in the dark like a house with all its fires lit. The wall began to change at its base. The ancient stone foundation lit first, the runes Bran the Builder had inscribed in the first stones becoming visible after 8,000 years of silence, running upward through the ice in lines that climbed with the precision of text being written, character by character, in letters 100 feet tall. The ice did not just freeze more deeply, it crystallized, growing in the geometric patterns of the runic characters, structuring itself with the specificity of something that had been designed rather than formed. The runes covered the wall's southern face in the time it takes a man to breathe in and breathe out, and then they covered the northern face too, and the wall stood in the dark between the army of the living and the army of the dead, blazing with the light of a purpose it had been built for and was performing for the first time. The ward network activated in sequence, every node feeding its accumulated energy into the wall through the runic connections below. The energy had been building for months, since the binding oath, since Ned spoke the rites in the Great Hall, since each node recognized what it was connected to and began drawing from whatever deep source the builder had tapped when he laid the first stone. The wall received it all and focused it and directed it northward, with the precision of an instrument designed by a man who had understood that a weapon was only useful if it knew what it was pointed at. Spears of structured ice erupted from the wall's northern face, not randomly, not a spectacle, with the selection of something that could see what it was aimed at, and through Bran, in the weirwood network above the battle, connected to ravens that wheeled in patterns he directed, the wall could see. The ice formations shattered white formations at 200 yards, the magical frequency in them disrupting the animation of the dead the way shatter steel disrupted it at blade contact. At distance now, at scale, the front ranks of the dead collapsed in the patterns of the ice strikes, not uniformly, not completely, but enough to create gaps, enough to slow the tide, enough to show the White Walkers that what they had advanced against was not what they had faced before. The Walkers moved backward a few steps, slowly, with the specific quality of things that have never moved backward, encountering the reason to begin. The Night King advanced. He came through the chaos of the disrupted dead with the patience of something that could not be disrupted because it had no formation to disrupt. He walked through the ice strikes without varying his pace. The structured ice that shattered white formations reached him and did not shatter. It slowed. It stopped. It fell from him in chips, like water from a surface that has decided not to be wet. He reached the wall's base. He pressed one hand against the ancient stone. The runes flinched. Not extinguished, flinched the way a fire flinches when the draft arrives. The ward network felt it through the nodes, and the feeling traveled south through the channels and arrived in Winterfell's walls as a pulse of cold that went through the empty castle's stones and reached Bran in the Godswood, where he sat with his hand on the heart tree and his eyes open and white and his face showing the strain of holding the network at full operational intensity for the first time. The stone recognized him. That was the problem the Wrights had named without fully solving. The section Ned had read 3 times and each time arrived at the same incomplete understanding. The Night King was first men blood transformed. He was the tradition that the wall was built from before the children had changed what it was. The wards could not simply reject him because he was not simply an enemy. He was a corrupted source. The wall was built to stop the dead. He was not dead. He was what happened when something living was made into something else, while the living part was still present, and 8,000 years had not finished the argument. The door opened, narrow, ground level. In the stone section of the wall's base where the foundation was, the section that had been sealed since the day the last stone was placed, 2 words in Old Tongue, words from the section labeled in the Wrights with the notation Ned had translated haltingly and read to Jon alone in a single private hour 3 weeks before the march. For the warden who must meet the Cold King, Jon stepped through. North side. Alone. Ghost did not follow. Ghost sat at the door's edge with his red eyes on Jon's back and did not move. The cold on this side was different, not worse, more present. The cold of the place where cold came from rather than the cold of a place cold had reached. The Night King stopped. He was 40 yards distant. Between them, the disrupted dead continued to fall, and the ice continued to reach from the wall, and the ward network continued to work at the edge of what Bran could sustain. None of that reached this space. This space was between the wall and the Night King and Jon Snow, and it operated by different rules than the battle around it. Jon spoke. Old Tongue first, the Builder's words, the first frequency, the ice tradition that was his through Lyanna and through Ned and through 8,000 years of Starks, standing in this specific piece of the world and paying attention to what it asked of them. The network responded through the stone beneath his feet, blue-white, cold and purposeful. Then High Valyrian, the ancient firecaller's greeting, the words Sam had sent north in a careful hand, transcribed from a text in the Night's Watch archives that predated the Freehold itself. Both. The braided frequency traveled not through the network and not through the stone, but through the air between them, the impossible combination, the thing that a single human body should not have been able to produce and was producing because the body that produced it had been born from both traditions simultaneously, ice and fire, winter and summer, the north and the south, and the deep old magic that both drew from and had never been combined. The Night King's face changed. After 8,000 years of patience, after 8,000 years of cold purpose and absolute forward motion, and the absolute absence of anything that was not that, something else. It moved across his face the way weather moves across the wall, arriving from a direction nobody had been watching. Recognition, not warmth, not surrender, something older and more specific than both of those things. The expression of a man who has been looking for something for 8,000 years without knowing what it was, and has just found it in a place he had not thought to look. The expression of a person who has been called by the correct name for the first time in a language they had not heard spoken since before they became what they are. He looked at Jon. Jon looked back. The ice fell from him in sheets, not violently, not with the drama of a battle or the finality of a killing blow. Sheets, the way ice falls from stone when the temperature finally tips past the relevant threshold, releasing what it has been holding because the holding has become unnecessary. Beneath the ice, nothing, no figure revealed, no transformed man standing in the place the Night King had occupied. The man who had stood in the haunted forest when the children drove the dragon glass through his heart had been gone for 8,000 years. The ice had simply not acknowledged this yet. Jon's voice had acknowledged it for him, and the ice, which had always been the vessel rather than the content, released what it was holding and fell. The White Walkers ceased, not all at once, beginning nearest and moving outward, the closest ones first, then the next, the cessation traveling through their ranks the way information travels through a command structure when the source of all command has been removed, one by one, the precise and ordered cessation of things that have been sustained by a single will and are now discovering what they are without it. Without the walkers, the dead fell, tens of thousands of bodies dropping into the snow of the haunted forest, with the unified sound of a decision being unmade, not violent, not dramatic, simply present one moment, absent the next, the animation leaving them the way smoke leaves a room when the fire finally goes out. The sound of it carried over the wall and down the southern face, and into the 15,000 men who stood and heard it and did not speak. The silence that followed was the loudest thing any of them had ever heard. Jon stood on the north side of the wall for a long time. He looked at the place where the ice had fallen, at the haunted forest, which was dark and still in the way it had been dark and still before any of this, before the dead and the walkers and the 8,000-year argument that had just reached its conclusion in a space 40 yards wide between a closed door and an open field of snow. He looked at the sky. The stars were coming out, the particular stars of deep winter, hard and clear and permanent, indifferent to everything that had just happened beneath them in the way that only very old things can be indifferent. He turned back to the door. He walked through it to the south side. He said nothing to the men watching from the battlements and the base of the wall and the field below, who were waiting for him to speak with the complete attention of 15,000 men, and the Night's Watch and his father standing at the door's edge with Ghost pressed against his leg. He did not speak. He walked to Ned, and he stood beside him, and he looked south at the north behind the wall, the network still glowing in the pre-dawn dark, every node lit, every god's wood burning its patient blue-white from the stony shore to last hearth, the whole vast system operating at full capacity for the first time in 8,000 years. He looked at it for a long time. Then he exhaled once, slowly the breath clouding in the cold and rising and dissolving in the air above them. "Well," Jon said, "that's done then." The cold retreated daily, not slowly, not the way a winter retreats across months, releasing its grip degree by degree in the manner of something that has given up reluctantly. It retreated as if a decision had been unmade. Each morning the temperature sat 2 degrees above where it had sat the morning before, not creeping upward but stepping as if the mechanism producing the cold had been switched off, and what remained was simply the residual, clearing. The sky cleared in patches. West first, then north, then everywhere, the hard stars of deep winter giving way to the particular blue of a sky that has remembered it has other colors available to it. The snow on the King's Road south of the wall stopped falling and began, cautiously, to melt at its edges. The haunted forest, which had been filled with the dead and then with the absence of the dead, stood in the new light with the particular quality of a space that has been through something, and is now simply a forest again. In the Winterfell Godswood, 3 days after the wall, Bran reported that the first green was showing through the snow at the base of the heart tree's roots. Not spring. It was too soon and too abrupt for spring, which arrived through its own logic regardless of what had been resolved in the dark. But the green was there, a thin line of it at the juncture of root and earth, where the root pressed against the soil that had been frozen since the cold arrived wrong, as if the tree had been waiting for permission to continue and had now received it. Ned stood in the Godswood and looked at it for a long time. The North's stocktake took 3 weeks and produced a document that Lewin wrote in his precise, careful hand, and Ned read twice and did not need to read a third time because the facts organized themselves clearly. The wall stood. Not merely stood operational for the first time in 8,000 years, the ward network active at every level from the foundation stones to the ice above them, the Night's Watch taking the correct oaths in the correct form, in the correct order, 10,000 sworn brothers, every one of them understanding what the words meant, because Jon had spent 12 months ensuring they understood before he allowed them to speak the words. 10,000 men where there had been fewer than 1,000. The Watch had not struggled to fill its ranks after the long night. After the long night, the Watch had a waiting list. The runic network from the stony shore to last hearth operated at full capacity, every node confirmed by Bran through the weirwood. Every godswood burning its patient blue-white at the mortar lines when Ned spoke the rites, not dramatically, not as spectacle, but steadily the way a machine runs steadily when it is performing the function it was built for. Moat Caelan stood with 20 towers and Howland Reed's eye on the causeway. The North had fed its people through the worst winter in living memory from stores Ned had been building for 3 years. From the moment he read the first line of the rites and understood how long he had to prepare, no holdfast had starved. No village had been abandoned. The cold had been severe and the stores had been sufficient. And the difference between those two facts was the difference between preparation and hope, which Ned had always understood to be the difference between the North and everywhere else. 200 shatter steel blades, the craftsman Mikken had trained in the forge's new methods, who could produce more. The dragonglass deposits the rites had specified, now identified and being mined. Enough for the North, with surplus to offer the South when the South was ready to ask for it, which it would be eventually, because the South was not immune to the Long Night simply because the Long Night had ended at the Wall. It had ended at the Wall this time. The rites did not promise it would always end at the Wall. These were facts. Ned kept them. The Raven from King's Landing arrived on a cold Tuesday morning in the 3rd week after the Wall. It carried no royal seal. The parchment was plain, the handwriting careful and anonymous in the way of a man who had learned to write important things in hands that could not be identified as his. The routing was unusual. It had come through Greywater Watch, via a whisper network that had no official existence and left no official record, delivered to the Winterfell maester by a Crannog man who had appeared at the castle gate at dawn with the Raven in a plain wooden cage and no explanation. Varys. The letter described the South with the precision of a man who had spent decades cultivating the ability to see clearly, and was now deploying that ability in a situation where clarity was the only remaining useful tool. Robert was dead. A hunting accident the description made sound like not an accident, the specific details arranged in a sequence that a man of Varys's observation skills would not have included if they had been accidental. Joffrey sat the Iron Throne under Cersei's control. The Lannister-Stark conflict, the parallel one, the one where a Robb Stark who had gone south had called his banners, was burning through the Riverlands. The Stormlands were splitting, the Reach was watching, the Ironborn were moving. Lord Stark, the letter ended, the realm is burning. Your hand is needed. There is no one else who has won what you have won and might use it to stop what is being lost. Ned read it twice. He set it on the table. He sat for a long time in the Lord's chamber where the hot springs warmed the walls, and the stones held the frequency of 8,000 years of Stark blood and purpose. He looked at the window, which showed Winterfell's yard, where the servants moved at their own rhythms in the morning light. He picked up his quill. Lewin transcribed the response without comment, which was his way of commenting. The North is whole. The Wall stands. The long night has passed. We will take no part in the wars of the South. Any refugee who reaches the Neck seeking safety will be sheltered. Any army that enters the Neck will not leave it. The King of the North has spoken. Ned signed it. He pressed the new seal, obsidian cut from a fragment of the Blood Vault stone, bearing the rune from Bran the Builder's tomb that had recognized his blood on the night this began. Lewin looked at the seal. He looked at the signature above it. He looked at Ned. King, the Northern Lords called me that when they pledged. Ned said, I did not correct them. Lewin did not answer. His expression performed the specific function it performed when he had arrived at an assessment he found simultaneously logical and difficult. His silence had a quality of careful endorsement. Did I need to? Ned asked. Lewin sealed the letter. He gave it to the Raven. He sent it south. Bran was in the Godswood and would spend increasing time there. Not lost. He came back for meals, for council sessions, for the specific occasions where Ned needed him present in a room rather than in the network. He ate. He spoke. He was present in the way of a person who has found the place where their capability and their purpose meet, and is living there without regret. The Weirwood network was more real to him than the castle, and the castle had learned to accept this. I am the North's eyes, he told Ned. One evening, when Ned had asked, not pressing, not demanding, simply asking the question a father asks when he wants to know if his child is well inside the thing that has claimed him. That is what I am for. Someone has to watch. He said it without grief. That was the thing that had taken Ned the longest to accept. Not that Bran had been called to this, but that Bran accepted the calling without the weight of loss. He was 7 years old, and he was the continent's most comprehensive intelligence network, and he was, as far as Ned could determine, entirely at peace with both of those facts. Arya was gone. She had left 3 days after the Wall, before the cold had fully retreated, before Ned had finished the stocktake, before anyone had organized themselves sufficiently to mount a coherent argument for her to stay. A horse, a sword, Nymeria's pack ranging ahead of her somewhere in the Riverlands. The note she left was short because Arya's notes were always short. People need help down there. I know what I'm doing. Don't send anyone after me. Ned read it 4 times. He folded it. He put it in the pocket of his cloak, where he kept the things he carried. He did not send anyone after her. He was afraid for her in the specific helpless way that parents are afraid for the children who are most fully themselves. He was also, beneath the fear, quietly proud, which he did not say to anyone. Robb governed. He was good at it, genuinely good, with the particular quality of competence that comes not from training, but from being correctly sized for a task. He sat in council and disagreed with Ned when Ned was wrong, which Ned considered the best possible outcome for a son. He had married a Riverlands girl, come north with the refugees from the Southern Wars, the kind of match that forms in the chaos of necessary proximity and proves, over months, to be right in ways that had nothing to do with the chaos. He was 17 years old, and he was running the North with the focused attention of a man who understood that running something well was not less than leading something gloriously, but more. Sansa had become something that had no prior name. The North's intelligence ran through her now, not because anyone had assigned it to her, but because she had been doing it before anyone thought to formalize it. She read the emissaries who arrived from the South with ladies' empathic precision, knowing the things beneath the things they said. She monitored the Warg Cell's political reports. She drafted the responses to the Southern Ravens that Ned signed. She was 14 years old, and she was the most dangerous person in Winterfell in any room that did not contain a drawn weapon. And she did not tell people this because people who needed to know it were better served by not knowing it. Rickon was 5. Shaggy Dog had grown to the size of a small bear and continued to grow with the patient disregard for reasonable limitation that had characterized him since birth. Rickon had nightmares, specific ones, about a place far north of the wall that he described in the mornings before the details dissolved. A cold place and a dark one, and something waiting in it that Rickon could not name but drew in charcoal on scraps of parchment in the hour after waking. Ned kept the drawings. Shaggy Dog still circled the castle at night, still covering the same circuit it had established on the night the wards awakened. The wards had not indicated a threat, but Shaggy Dog had not missed a single night. Ned did not ask what it was watching for. Jon had been named the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch by the unanimous vote of his brothers, the youngest in the Watch's history, by a margin that required no second ballot. He was rebuilding the order properly. 10,000 men, sworn with the correct oaths under the correct conditions, armed with dragon glass and shatter steel and the knowledge of why they stand there. He sent Ned a raven every week. The ravens always arrived with Ghost's white fur caught in the tie string. The weirwood root had broken through the stone floor of the Great Hall. Lewin had documented this event in 3 separate Maester's reports, each one more precisely worded and less satisfying than the last, because the event resisted the vocabulary of mastery. The root had pressed through the foundation stone at the hall's eastern end, through 2 feet of Winterfell granite that had not shifted in 800 years, and had shaped itself, not randomly, not with the formlessness of organic growth, into something that the eye kept returning to and the mind kept organizing into a specific category. A seat, not a throne in the southern sense, no iron, no elevation, no architectural performance of power. A seat in the oldest sense, the place where the thing that decided sat when it needed to decide. The root was warm when Ned approached it, not the warmth of the deep spring water or the warmth of a fire, the warmth of the tree extending itself into the hall, the tree still connected to the heart tree in the godswood, whose roots ran under the entire castle, which had sent this part of itself here with a purpose Ned was only beginning to understand. He sat because Bran had asked him to, and Bran did not ask for things without reason. The visions that came were too much, too long, too specific, too complete. The whole North spread before his awareness the way a map spreads before the eye, except that this map was alive and present tense, and he could feel every note of it simultaneously, every godswood and runestone and warded wall from the stony shore to the wall. He held it for as long as he could. He breathed. Then he looked at the map table from the weirwood seat and let the visions recede to the edges where they were manageable. The map showed the world, the South illustrated by smoke and raven reports, and Arya's wolf circles through the Riverlands and Varys' careful neutral intelligence. The War of 5 Kings burning through cities and harvests, and the accumulated lives of hundreds of thousands of people dying over a chair built from the swords of men who had lost to a man who was now also dead. The North was a fortress and a machine and a family. Its dead were buried honorably in crypts that knew their names. Its living were fed, Its walls glowed at the mortar lines with the patient frequency of a purpose that had waited 8,000 years and had now been given its task. Its wolves ranged free. The weirwood was warm beneath him, the stones were warm around him. The hall that had stood for 800 years and had been built on a foundation 8,000 years older than that held him in the particular way that old things hold the people they were made for. Without effort, without ceremony, the way a hand holds something that fits it. Ned Stark, Lord of Winterfell, king in the north by the acclamation of 23 lords in a hall that had glowed for them as proof, warden of the realm's oldest and most necessary purpose, sat in the living wood of his ancestors and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, quietly, to the walls that had always been listening, to the foundation stones that had recognized his blood before he recognized himself in them, to the 8,000 years of Starks who had walked these crypts and spoken to their dead and carried the weight of a purpose they had forgotten, without ever fully losing, the only words that were both entirely true and entirely sufficient. The North remembers, he said, and the North is ready. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.